Hello there, and welcome to Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together. It's presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary, and it's been my privilege to share the hosting of this series of conversations throughout Ramadan. Ramadan is of course characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. This year, COVID-19 has made that impossible. So Affinity initiated this online iftar. If you missed any, each of the 27 episodes of Ramadan Conversations is available for download from Affinity's YouTube page. Tonight, our assistant host is Makiz Ansari. Makiz is a religion and values teacher at Sydney's Amity College. She's worked as a research assistant in the Political Economy Department of Sydney University and is currently completing her Masters in Islamic Studies at Charles Sturt University. Makiz, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you again here, John. Thank you.
We come to the end of Ramadan this evening for our series of programs. Tonight is the 27th and final program. We've had some great guests from Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Italy, and USA and Canada. Tonight, as a grand finale, we'll be conversing with guests in both Canada and the United Kingdom. So I'm just wondering, if you've been an active participant in these conversations, as a co-host, were there any particular highlights for you?
Well, it's unbelievable how the 27 days just went. It's been a highlight, quite honestly, as you mentioned, actively on my end in terms of engaging and listening to mainly yourselves, John, and also to George. It's been just too many highlights for me to pin down in this session. But as a co-host, it's just been a pleasure to be working with you to begin with, and Affinity and your level of professionalism and all of that. So that's been a learning curve for me personally, but also the caliber of our speakers, going from Italy to Hong Kong, today to Canada, UK, just the level of the candid conversations we've had, ranging from sports and its contribution to dialogue and peace and social cohesion, to spirituality, whether it was the 27th day of the momentous occasion in the Muslim calendar, just the frankness in those conversations, exploring our rich spiritual traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, the Aboriginal speakers and the incredible instrumental performance and the conversations. It's just been way too many for me to actually pin it down to one. But I must admit, this whole online experience, John, has been incredible. During this COVID-19 has been one of the best parts of interfaith dialogue and engagement.
Yes, all of a sudden we have an international online community that is as rich almost as a face-to-face discussion. It's been quite extraordinary, really.
Extraordinary.
So, well, look, so before we welcome our first guest this evening, let's sit back and get comfortable and enjoy a special musical performance from Recep Goyedin.
Girebilsen şu sinemde neler var, gülüp oynadım ele karşıdır, karşıdır, ele karşıdır. Girebilsen karşıdır, karşıdır, ele karşıdır. Sabahın seheri günden ileri, ben kimi sevmişim senden ileri. Ziyaret olmuşsun kurban istersin, kurban bulamadım candan ileri, ileri candan ileri. Ziyaret olmuşsun kurban istersin, kurban bulamadım candan ileri, ileri candan ileri.
A beautiful performance there from Recep Gojidin, all the way from Germany. You're on Ramadan Conversations, and tonight we're off to Western Canada and the city of Calgary, where our first guest is Dr Wes Thiessen, best known in his community as Dr Wes. Wes is a sessional instructor at Ambrose University, also an instructor in Muslim chaplaincy at Glenbow College. He's a family mediator with the Resolve Legal Group and also runs his own program, Lunas, Learning to Understand Islam. And if that's not enough, Dr Wes also serves as the part-time pastor of Dalmead Church, just outside of Calgary. Welcome, Dr Wes.
Good evening, John. Thank you very much.
Makiz, the first question to you.
Thank you, John. Good evening to you too, Dr. Wes, and welcome to our last conversation for Ramadan. You have made, as we just heard from John, interfaith dialogue and a large part of your both professional and personal life, clearly as almost a full-time interfaith facilitator. Now, what drew you, I was intrigued, to this field?
I think probably what drew me there was my initial experience living in a multi-faith and multilingual environment when I was living in Jerusalem in the 1980s. I went there initially to study at an American school for one semester in order to try and enhance my education prior to my plans of going into seminary, but found the experience so exhilarating and interesting that I shelved my ideas and I stayed there for 2 years, completing a master's degree. But it was really as a result of that experience that I decided that I wanted to spend a considerable amount of my life and my time living in another culture, and in 1997 moved to North Africa with my family and lived in North Africa for 15 years.
Wow.
Wow.
Well, that's an extraordinary journey. And a dozen questions could spring off that. Perhaps we can explore one or two of them. But just to your experience working in the multi-faith community locally, many Christians would be quite comfortable with building bridges of social interaction with their Muslim neighbours and have become so over the last 10 or 15 years. But genuine interfaith dialogue, where beliefs and even theology are shared and discussed, is still a bit of a step too far for many local congregations, let alone churches. How do you approach that end of the challenge?
Well, I think it really depends on how comfortable you are in talking to somebody who has a different belief than you do. You know, when I talk to my students, I make it quite clear to them that we as people experience life on 3 different levels. So we all are human beings, so we all share humanity with each other. And then we're all part of another segment. And this can be all sorts of different things, that you might belong to a particular religion, or you might belong to an ethnic community, or even a neighborhood. And then on another level, very lowest level, we're all individuals. We are all different from each other. And it's this central part where we make decisions about how much we want to interact with people who are different than us. But we can do that because we all have this humanity in common with each other. We share this all together. And there are so many things that we have in common that we don't celebrate. Most of the time, we're looking at what makes us different. But even when we talk about religious faith, we can talk about the things that are actually similar, which will bring us together, which maybe will open the door and create some trust and build a bridge where we can start to talk about the ways that we're different from each other.
Makiz.
Very intriguing, very interesting, and I love that pyramid-like depiction of yours, Dr. Wes. At the highest level is that Adamic bond, that common humanity. Just love that. And how comfortable are we to talking to each other? I guess it just boils down to that. So thank you for that. I understand that you have been involved with some interfaith services for the newly arrived refugees in Calgary. Now, is this part of a program of practical assistance? How is it linked to existing faith communities at your part of the world?
Well, I guess I've been involved at two different levels. At one level, when I first came back to Canada, I was very interested in trying to be able to make use of some of my linguistic experiences and wanted to work as a translator for immigrants. And so I actually volunteered through a local church to participate with them as a translator from English into Arabic and Arabic into English for a new immigrant family that came to Calgary. And that was simply to try and help people resettle. I discovered that sometimes the expectations that I have on what I can be involved in and what the reality is isn't always the same. And so I decided that I wanted to have a little bit more experience than what I was getting simply doing language translation, which is quite restrictive as far as social interaction on the side. And I got more involved in the Turkish immigrant community here in Calgary. They were also very welcoming to me, very warm towards me. One day, as a result of, I suppose, God's divine intervention, I bumped into a gentleman from the Turkish community. He came to purchase some things at a garage sale that I was hosting. And we talked for quite a while. He's actually Turkmen, not Turkish, but he spent many years living in Turkey before he immigrated to Canada. And at the end of the conversation, as I was helping him pack all these things into his car, he told me, well, I asked for his business card so we could be in touch or something like that. And I discovered that he was the executive director of the Intercultural Dialogue Institute. And when I discovered that, I just thought, oh, my goodness, we have to have a conversation together. So we set up a lunch together. And from that, I started on a longer road in developing deeper relationships with Muslims here in Calgary, talking about faith at an intercultural and interreligious level.
Amazing story of divine intervention indeed from that garage sale, Dr. Wes. Incredible. With that note on further deepening the interfaith and intercultural practices, I also understand that you hold complementary Bible and Koran readings. Now, what are some of the things that have been gained from these engagements?
Well, there are many things that can be gained. First of all, you get to know other people. Secondly, of course, the obvious one is you get to understand more about the sacred books of another religion. But I think more than that, and maybe surprisingly for some, you actually learn more about your own faith as a result of examining somebody else's faith. Sometimes people are afraid to go outside of their boxes. They're familiar with things and they want to stay within their familiarity. But it's when we decide that we have enough confidence in what we believe that we can maybe step out and meet somebody different than ourselves and explore some of what they believe, that we actually then start to understand better what we ourselves believe and what our own faith consists of. So if it's for nothing else than to understand yourselves better, I would encourage people to be involved. But it's really the richness that you get in meeting other people and understanding faith from another perspective.
Stephen Prothero, the professor of religion at Boston University, a few years ago wrote a book called God is Not One. He was pointing to some in the interfaith arena who say, look, we're all on different paths up the same mountain. but he was of the view that we may all be climbing, but on different paths and on very different mountains. What's your response to that sort of argument?
Well, this is a very difficult question, and it's debated by people in lots of different circles, and some are lay people and some are theologians. I remember reading a very good book on this called Allah. I can't remember the subtitle, but the author of the book is Miroslav Volf. And Miroslav Volf is an Eastern European from a Christian background, and I believe that he is a professor now at Yale University. And one of the things that he talks about is the idea of a referent, and then of a particular individual. So sometimes we use God to talk about something that we're referring to. And it really helps me explain it to people if we ask the question, do you believe that God is the person who is responsible for creating everything that we see around us? And everybody in Christianity and in Judaism and in Islam would all agree that that's who God is, and that this being that we refer to as God is all-powerful and has authority over everything. And again, all three religions would believe the same thing. So when we can say and we can agree that this is who God is, then how is it possible that there could be more than one of these? There can't be. And that Islam and Christianity and Judaism are really talking about a similar being. Now, I've only just met you, John. I've heard a little bit about you, but I don't know really that much about you. And I believe certain things about you that could be true, or they might not be true. And if I were to have a deeper conversation with you about who you are and what your character is and what your nature is, then I might have a better understanding of who you are. But everybody knows that when I'm talking about John Cleary, I'm talking about you. Whether I know everything about you or I don't know everything about you. And I think this is also the same thing with God, that we talk about God and we mean the same being, but we don't all understand the same thing about who he is. I don't think anybody in any one of those religions would stand up and say, I know everything about God. And I think we all agree that when we get onto the other side of this world, in the afterlife, that we will have a much clearer understanding of exactly who God is. Why do we spend so much time arguing about who God is? And why don't we spend more time in caring for each other as human beings and as creatures of God?
Yes, and I'm sure each of my friends who know me might describe me in a different way. I think that analogy is quite brilliant, and particularly the last. Let's not argue about what we think he said, but what he wants us to do. Makiz, you've got another question.
I do actually. It was quite a brilliant analogy, and what you just mentioned also, John, reminded me of this quote from Rumi, the great mystical poet, who said that everybody knows me from their own frame of references. So there's a lot of semantics and a lot of filters that we all, as subjective beings, I guess, project onto our notion of whatever that reality may be, or in this case, what the divine or the nature of divine may be. So profound conversation here. I'm drawn, but I have to stick to my questions. Dr. Wes, what, from your understanding, what commonalities can we usefully draw from our traditions as a basis for shared personal and civic values? So from your experience in interfaith dialogue, what are those key commonalities that we can draw, to which you've been alluding to us as well?
Well, I think that every single one of those Abrahamic faiths has a very deep concept in morality, what we believe that is right or good for us to do. I think each of them also would ascribe to the idea that we are creatures of God, and as such, we each deserve respect, and there are concepts of justice that we all need to work towards. And I think these three basic things together are what can help glue us together as a society, and certainly give people the concept that we must actually stand together and fight for the rights that each individual and each community should be ascribed within our developed society. You know, as one of the subjects that I teach in the university at Ambrose is cultural anthropology. And oftentimes in the West, we have this belief that because we are so advanced technologically, intellectually, we think that we are more developed. And the more developed we are, we have this maybe false understanding that we are better, that there is some better quality to who we are because of this development. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Sometimes when we look at other cultures, or even now in our own situation with COVID, where we're so restricted in what we're able to do, I think somehow our society in these few weeks has become a little gentler and a little kinder. And it's actually this kindness that I would add into the mix of the justice that we need to stand for, as well as the human rights for each individual. But I think the basic foundations of our three faiths, the monotheistic faiths, even just Christianity and Islam, standing up for justice and for the rights of each other is a very, very important foundation for us to be involved in civic life and caring for each other, whether that be somebody across the street or across the country or across the world.
You mentioned cultural anthropology there, and I think one of the difficulties with interfaith discussions is to sort out the distinctions between faith and culture. This is even a problem within religious traditions, where a religious tradition becomes fused with ancient cultural habits. I guess the most outstanding example would be something like female genital mutilation. But how much of a challenge to genuine understanding is this tension?
I think this is a big tension. I was just, before the interview, I was going over one of my students' journals from the classes. I have them all write reflections after each day of class so that they can remember some of those thoughts that really meant something to them. And this was precisely the point that this particular student was bringing up, is that sometimes we confuse religion with culture. And what's really helpful for individuals in trying to better understand this or pull these two things apart is when you actually move into another culture and you try to maintain what your religious beliefs are surrounded by a new culture, as you try to integrate what your belief system is into this new culture. For some people, they do this willingly. They move from one place in the world to another place in the world for whatever reason. Sometimes people do this because it's forced upon them as asylum seekers or refugees. And when we encounter our life surrounded by a different culture, all of a sudden we begin to have to ask ourselves the questions, what part of what I believe was actually encased in culture and isn't really the religious belief that I have? And then you ask yourself the question, well, what exactly are my religious beliefs? And then maybe how can I take those religious beliefs and translate them in a new way through a new culture in the place where I am now?
It's an extraordinary challenge. I mean, you're even getting an example perhaps in the United States at the moment, where you have a culture that seems to be divided between those who are hyper-individualist and those who still want to hang on to some communitarian sense, and that's splitting even evangelical churches.
Definitely. This is a very difficult time, and you add into that the political sphere, and all of a sudden you're going to get the country that's going to be fractured. It's interesting to watch as we see history unfold in front of us, and all of us are faced with these questions now in these times. And again, I go back to thinking about COVID. In this situation, one of the other things that we're experiencing is a loss of control. And as we study culture, it's always interesting to think about what is our concept of control. Is the control within us, inside of us? Do we control who we are and where we are and what we're doing? Or is the control for us external to ourselves? Does it come from another being? Is there somebody that's imposing this on us? And every religion discusses this theological debate between fatalism or free will. We have it within Christianity and Calvinism and Armenianism, and we have it within the Islamic tradition. So this is not uncommon to the different religious faiths, and we're facing it now, and people are reframing how they believe, what their power and control is over their life. Now we're living very differently than we expected we were going to be 2 months ago. What other things will we lose control over, and how will that change or impact what we believe, and then how will that change our behavior?
Makiz?
Absolutely. It's just like as if COVID-19 has been almost mirroring to us our reality and asking us to get into that contemplation you just teased this week, Dr. Wes. Incredible points there. Now on COVID-19, I was wondering, how are your daily life? You alluded to kindness and seeing a little bit of other things perhaps during this pandemic. In Dalmead and in Calgary area in particular, how has that been playing out for you? And particularly over the Christian season of Easter and now Ramadan, how has that played out in your part of the town?
Well, for me personally, during this more lockdown or social isolation, I've actually found myself busier than usual. It's been a spring where I expected actually to do some intensive teaching, but on a university campus, and everything went onto the web. So we've done everything virtual. I had a class of 15 students 1 week from 9 to 4, Monday to Friday. And the weeks before that and the weeks after that, I had another class of 20 students meeting every single day from 9 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. So my teaching schedule has been extremely intense. It's now come to a close. But I certainly don't think that the lockdown has made me more relaxed or made me slow down. It's sped up. I think it might slow down a little bit now. But I think, this is where we can take advantage of the situation, which is exactly what you've done with this program, Ramadan Conversations. We don't let our restrictions now stop us from what we want to do. And the communities have to make some kind of adjustments. We've made adjustments in our church community. Up until the 22nd of March, we were meeting once a week in a very small rural church, maybe about 24 of us meeting together. And when the regulations came down from the province that we would no longer be able to meet, I explored with the church board the idea of meeting together on Zoom. Now, for me, I lived overseas for 15 years. I did a lot of meetings virtually with people all over the world, sometimes on a weekly basis, using Zoom as a platform. And so for me, this was just a shift back into my old normal. And it was a little bit more difficult for some of the people in the church. But over the last 2 months, we've been meeting virtually in a Zoom room with our church. We meet in the same room every Sunday. And the first couple of weeks, there were some challenges. Most of the congregation are more elderly. And so making the adjustments for technology has been difficult for them. But it's enabled us as a community to stay together, to be in touch with each other. And this has been the greatest impact of the virtual meetings. Not only have the people who really want to continue to be a part of the weekly services attended, but we've actually had some people who, for mobility reasons or for geography reasons, wouldn't have been able to go to the physical location of the church that are now able to attend the services on Sunday virtually. And so we actually expand our base a little bit. Now, this is something that's similar for the people in the Muslim community here in Calgary, specifically the community that I'm most familiar with, those of the Turkish Muslim community and the Intercultural Dialogue Institute specifically. Every year during Ramadan, they host iftar dinners, and they invite people from the community to join them. And every year, this is something that I look forward to, being able to visit with my Turkish friends and share a meal together with them, enjoy great food, and catch up with each other and deepen our relationships with each other. But this year, they weren't going to be able to do the traditional iftar dinners. And so IDI here in Calgary decided, well, we're going to bring the dinner right to your doorstep. And they've had virtual dinners for iftar just the same way that we have had virtual services for our church. So it's enabled people in the community to be able to come and attend, to meet some Muslims, to understand what Ramadan is, to understand the practice of fasting in the Muslim community, and the special atmosphere that is experienced in breaking the fast together as a larger group, or even as a family on a regular basis during all the evenings of Ramadan, and all of the wonderful ritual that goes along with that, and the meaning that's poured into that ritual for the families and the people who participate.
Well, it's just finally, picking up that theme, Easter shares certain similarities with Ramadan. Easter, the period of Lent leading up to Easter, was a time when in the larger denominations of Christianity, perhaps the Anglican or the Catholic traditions, there was a strong tradition that during Lent you went on a period of meditation, reflection, even fasting for some. What are you going to give up for Lent? It was a sort of occasional joke. Yet it was related over more recent generations to individual practice. In Ramadan, you see this as an expression of community. Is it possible that Lent can learn something of Ramadan? That is, we have a genuinely similar ethos surrounding both. Yet a Christian experience of Ramadan, I talk to so many Christians who are saying, I just didn't realise how worthwhile an experience this could be, and causes them to rethink Lent. Here's practical interfaith dialogue.
I would be really curious, John, to study the practices of Lent in more communitarian cultures around the world. I think that what you've described is also resonating with the fact that most Christian expressions that we know of or are familiar with around the world come from very individualized cultures. I think that more Muslim communities, as they're starting to migrate towards the West, they're coming from a more communitarian background or culture and into a more individualistic culture. I know where I was in North Africa, the practice during Ramadan was the immediate families that would break fast together. And it was unusual to see a larger gathering together. And it's only when I've come here and seen some of these Turkish Muslims that gather together once a week in a much larger group that I've seen a different cultural setting. But the practice within Islam of fasting is very singular. It's very homogenous. There is one way to fast, and there are specific regulations that all Muslims must practice in order to fast appropriately. Within Christianity, as you said, during the time of Lent, the idea is that people will give something up for Lent. And this is much more of maybe a more recent historical development within Christianity. Christianity is 2,000 years old. We can also follow the Jewish tradition and go back and ask how fasting was done in the Jewish communities. And I think those would mirror the Muslim practice more similarly than what we see in Christianity. I think in Christianity there is the focus now that Jesus has come and he has completed so much of what we needed to accomplish on our behalf, that now we are living in a period or a transition of grace where the law is now being fulfilled. It doesn't mean that there aren't things for us to do, but we as Christians practice our faith in a different way. And it's some of these things that change what those practices have been. And we can even see some of this change happening with baptism historically in Christianity. And so I see some of this as a historical development, but also influenced by the culture that we're in, whether it's an individualized culture or a communitarian culture. And you might find some Christians in other places where the culture is more communitarian, following more communal practices like we see with the Muslim Ummah, where they all practice fasting in one particular way.
Dr. Wes, it's a fascinating conversation. We could continue it, but it's a conversation that's spreading out across many, many communities in the face of COVID. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a privilege.
Well, it's been a delight. Thank you very much. It was wonderful to meet you, both John and Makiz. And assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Thank you, Dr. Wes.
And now, Makiz, we've time for a musical interlude from Canada. It's by Amit Gul.
Elveda ya, elveda ya, şehri Ramazan elveda, elveda ya, elveda ya. Şehri Kur'an elveda, rahmet sendin hem bereket, sen ümittin ve mağfiret, sen güzellik, sen hasrettin, İyilik sendin, sen merhamet, rahmet sendin, hem bereket, sen ümittin ve mağfiret, sen güzellik, sen hasrettin, iyilik sendin, sen merhamet. Elveda ey namaz ayı, elveda ey Kur'an ayı, elveda ey rahmet ayı, duayı, rahmet sendin hem bereket, sen ümittin ve mağfiret, sen güzellik, sen hasrettin, iyilik sendin, sen merhamet, rahmet sendin, hem bereket, sen ümittin ve mağfiret, sen güzellik, sen hasrettin, iyilik sendin, sen merhamet, iyilik sendin, sen merhamet.
Amit Gul from Canada. A beautiful performance.
Very appropriate for the timing as well, John. Farewelling this
Yeah.
month of Ramadan.
Well, now, Makiz, we're off to the United Kingdom, to London in particular, where we're joined by Turkish writer, journalist and academic Kerim Balci. He's currently living in London as a refugee from the regime in Turkey. He volunteers at the Turkey Institute and London Advocacy as a research fellow and communications officer. Kerim served as the editor-in-chief of Turkish Review, a semi-academic journal on Turkey and Turkish politics, and as a regular columnist at Zaman newspaper, before these media outlets were taken over and eventually closed down by the current government. Kerim Balci, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Makiz.
Thank you.
Kerim, the past few years have been difficult for many Turkish people. As I understand, you came down to Australia a few years back and then went back to England. Can you tell us a little bit about your own personal journey? And is there a sense of psychic as well as personal dislocation? Or does your faith enable you to echo the old saying, every land is my father's land?
I mean, that's a beautiful question, John. First of all, we are regular human beings. Every kind of personal dislocation is accompanied with a psychic dislocation, or at least a questioning about human nature. You know, particularly when injustices are observed from within the same religious community that you feel adhered to. It shocks human nature more. I always believed in the values system of Islam, and I thought when religious people came to power, things will change. Turkey was never a perfect democracy, but we had hopes about religious people, because we thought they wouldn't steal, we thought they wouldn't oppress, because of the very essence of the religion that we belonged to. But we have seen the complete opposite when people with religious beliefs came to power, because I don't know, because they prioritize this worldly aspects of their religious adherence, they might become even more oppressors than the secular ones. So, of course, I did start questioning my own religious tradition, my own understanding of religion and state. Years before me, names like Ustaz Fethullah Gulen had already introduced to our lives the idea of secularism in governance, but there is a difference between understanding things after you lived an experience or before you lived an experience. I traveled throughout the world in 2015 when largely the oppression in Turkey against the Gulen movement and the Kurds started. And I tried to raise awareness all around the world. And I was moved by the fact that people that belonged to non-Islamic traditions were more ready to listen to me, more caring, more empathetical about my and my people's sufferings. And they, of course, that experience had told me a lot. I now know that values are not necessarily do not necessarily belong to one religious tradition. Good Muslims first have to be good human beings, and we need both education. You cannot just train and educate people to becoming better Muslims if you didn't first train them to be better citizens, better human beings. And we do have a lot to give and take to other religious or philosophical traditions also.
Makiz.
Yes, Dr. Balci, welcome from my end as well, and it's great to have you and share some of your perspectives. You said you've traveled a lot around the world. Hopefully, during the course of this conversation, we can allude to some of those insights you may have tapped into. Now, clearly part of the global Hizmet movement that you're part of, it's obvious how much of a significant place it actually has in your personal life. Now, I guess my question is, what would be that message of Fethullah Gulen or Hoca Efendi that motivates within you such a level of commitment? In other words, what draws you or drew you to Hizmet, and why, maybe?
Makiz, I personally have been socialized into the movement, not by the movement. I can say I was really born into it. So my experience of the philosophy of Fethullah Gulen is not something that came to me from outside, but it was rebuilt in me. And I can observe that a lot of the, say, followers of the Hizmet movement all around the world are actually minuscule Fethullah Gülens in themselves. They do not take a kind of ideological teaching from outside, but they build up their own Fethullah Gülens in themselves. It is an internal travel, an internal travel towards perfection, maybe. So it is largely internalized. So I don't feel myself as adhering to something that is outside me, but it is in me altogether. It is me. I would say, like late president of the Palestinian state, Yasser Arafat, when he joined for the first time to the Socialist International, he was referred to as Mr. Palestine. So I feel myself as Mr. Hizmet, and I believe thousands of other followers of Hizmet community do feel in the same way. Let me say what still motivates me in the philosophy of Fethullah Gulen. It came all within the context of Turkish self-perception, let me say. It was largely 1970s, early 1980s that I first started to feel myself as belonging to the community, and my identity was being built at that stage as a young primary school child, and I was observing a certain level of inferiority complex in my Turkish community, in my own family, in my own neighborhood, in the Turkish cities, and so on. Turkey was largely a backward, I may say, economically backward country at that time, but it was accompanied with an inferiority complex. We cannot do anything. It is all the Westerners. They rule the world. We are just a satellite, and so on. To a large extent, human agency has been lost in the self-perception of the Turkish people. Of course, there was here and there post-imperialist people who believed in the second coming of the Ottoman Empire. They still do so, but these were not realistic dreams. They were just, living in the past. But largely, people were, it was not self-criticism. It was all lost of trust and respect to the self. Among this, Fethullah Gulen came out and taught us the importance of human agency. This may come to you as an paradox, because Gulen is a man of religion, and usually all religions, including Islam, gives agency to God, not a human being. Gulen is not like that. Gulen taught us that we can do it. We have to do it. Following President Obama, many world leaders started to use the slogan, "We can." We had already learned that slogan from Fethullah Gulen back in 1970s. We can, and we should. And that inferiority complex was beaten by the schools that were opened by the call of Fethullah Gulen. And suddenly we started to realize the Turkish people can win Olympics in mathematics, physics, biology Olympics. We can be better than others, not necessarily Westerners, in science and so on. So we were not stuck into the religious, Middle Ages training only. We can actually be good in medicine. We can be good in computing and so on. That was a gift given by Fethullah Gulen to not only the community itself, the Hizmet community, but to the overall Turkish people, and I may say also to the Muslim people all around the world.
Kerim, you've just about covered all I was going to ask in my next question. Makiz, ask your next question, and perhaps I'll have a follow-up there.
Sure. Well, taking it, and there's so much to unpack in your questions, and you've been quite thorough, like John said, Dr. Balci. During this pandemic in particular, you have been instrumental in establishing what is called the Voice of Hizmet online. Now, please tell us what are the aims of this initiative, and how has that been going on in your community?
Makiz, well, first of all, the United Kingdom had a delayed start of the lockdown. So we waited until the end of March to realize the severity of the pandemic. And when suddenly the lockdown loomed on us, several members of my community here were left in darkness, in the sense that the communication from the government sources was coming only in English. The Hizmet movement all around the world is quite an educated movement, but we have received more than 50% of our Britain community, Hizmet in Britain community, only in the last 2 years because of the persecution of Gülen movement in Turkey. So we are largely a refugee accepting community here. If I can say, we are about 1,000 families in United Kingdom. Half of this number came only in the last 2 years. And A lot of them cannot communicate in English, particularly when it comes to receiving and understanding new rules from London, the Parliament, and the government. So we realized that we needed a second, parallel communication line that will translate the regulations that came from the government. We call it number 10 here. On the day, a lot of people, particularly asylum seekers and new refugees, didn't know how the regulations about asylum seeking processes changed. There were families who had actually been given the right to family reunion, but part of the family was stuck in Greece or other countries waiting to be reunited with the members of the family. So we needed a communication line. We established a temporary website, onlinehizmet.org, where we tried to translate every regulation, every financial initiative that was started by the government into Turkish. But also, we wanted the host society, the British society, to realize that we were not here just serving to the self-interest of the community, but also we wanted to be a part of the national fight against the pandemic. We wanted to volunteer, we wanted to support our national health services, our key workers, and so on. So we started translating some of the Turkish material that we produced during the time of the pandemic into English. We established small initiatives of doctors giving advice online, because in the middle of the night your child has high fever and you don't know what to do, and if you call NHS, they most probably tell you just wait for a few weeks, and if you cannot breathe, only call them afterwards because of the extreme busy lines and so on. At such times, psychological support becomes even more important than the actual support that only NHS would be able to give. We had members of the family, members of the Hizmet movement in United Kingdom pass away because of the pandemic. We needed to find ways how to have an Islamic funeral at a time where we cannot join the funeral. So for the first time in my life, we actually had an online funeral prayer and so on. Only 3 members of the family was left to join the engraving burial ceremony. So we made a live broadcast of the ceremony, which is quite important in Turkish culture, if not in the Islamic culture. So in that sense, it was kind of state of emergency measure, but it brought us together. Obviously, because of the post-trauma distress we have been passing through after the persecution in Turkey, we did have members of our community, putting some distance to others and so on. They didn't want to mingle with the rest of the community for some time. But this pandemic together again. It was not the pandemic, but it was our response to the pandemic. And next Monday, for example, we are going to have also a United Kingdom, Ireland, Iceland, all together Ramadan festival celebration, largely for the children. But in those times, we become a community.
That's wonderful. We've now just time for a little music interlude, again by Ahmet Gul from Canada. Back with you shortly.
Deryalar içinde susuz gezerim, beni kandıracak umman bulunmaz. Deryalar içinde susuz gezerim, beni kandıracak umman bulunmaz. Herkesin derdine derman bulunur, şu benim derdime derman bulunmaz. Aşkın pazarında canlar satılır, satarım canımı, alan bulunmaz. Aşkın pazarında canlar satılır, satarım canımı, alan bulunmaz. Yusuf'u yitirdi Kenan ilinde, Yusuflar bulunur, Kenan bulunmaz. Aşık öldü diye sala verirler, ölen gafilimiz aşıklar ölmez. Yusuf öldü diye selam verirler, ölen hayvan imiş Yusuflar ölmez, Yusuflar ölmez.
Ahmed Gul, another beautiful performance. And our guest this evening is Kerim Balci. Kerim is a senior journalist, formerly of Zaman in Turkey and now working out of London. Makiz, you have another question.
I certainly do. Thank you, John. That was an amazing piece of music for sure. Speaking on political and musical note, Dr. Balci, now I'll quote you, "Only those who overflow with love will build the happy and enlightened world of the future," echoes Fethullah Gulen or Hoca Efendi. Now, it is definitely a moving and a beautiful sentiment. But my question is everybody, everyone capable of feeling such expression of love? How do we know what we are driven by is love? Is it compassion? Is it empathy? And how does one find that love within? Can you please help us to unpack that beautiful quote and perhaps what love looks like for you from this remark of Hoca Efendi?
Makiz, let me start from the second part of the quotation. It is, for me, the part of love is just intrinsic to Hoca Efendi and to Islam. But the idea to build the happy and enlightened world of the future is unique to Hoca Efendi. Many people, many Muslims around the world do not realize that Islam ordains two paradises, not only one. Many people think that we live a world only for the hereafter, and our aim is to attain the qualities that will open us the gates of the paradise after that. In Hoca Efendi's understanding, and in fact in the Sufi understanding altogether, Islam is about, I will quote an Arabic term, Sa'adat Darain, meaning the happiness, felicity of the two worlds. We have been sent down to this world not as refugees from the paradise, but builders of paradise on this world. First of all, that is the building block of Fethullah Gülen's philosophy of love. When you realize and you believe that you are in this world with an aim, a mission to establish an almost utopian dream of universal peace, of a world that is paradise, of, I'm going to use a Christian term here, a world where sheep sleeps together with the lion, then you realize that love, overflowing love in human beings is possible. We do not have the belief of original sin in Christianity or similar things in Judaism. Islam believes in essential good nature of human beings. We do believe that everybody is capable of loving because human beings are created in the image of God, and God is pure love. God
Yes.
is pure peace. If we are vicegerents, of course, in potentially vicegerents of this world, we always have to do our best to be God-like. And you cannot do that without loving as God loves. We do believe everybody is capable of it. And it is nurtured in intercommunal relations. You don't just make recitations and readings and so on that it comes to you, but we do have a kind of theology of love also. In Hadith Qudsi, a tradition that came down to us from our Prophet, our Lord, Allah says, when Allah loves a servant of Him, meaning a human being, He asks the angels and He says, I love this person, love him. And the angels come down to the earth and they cry out to the human beings and the world, animals, the whole world. God loves this particular person, love him. But that love is initiated by God in return for our love for God. A famous Turkish poem, Yunus Emre, taught us in the 13th century. We love everything created because of our love to the Creator. If God has created these things out of His love, we have to love them also. This includes things that in appearance are not good things for us. Sickness, a pandemic, illness, viruses, bacteria. I have an 8-year-old daughter and she has been asking me difficult questions. Daddy, why God created coronavirus? Why God created illnesses? Why God created that? And so on. But these are all part of a global mission of human beings to convert this world into a paradise. And from that feeling of mission emanates the love for the others.
Kerim, I'm going to ask you one final question, and it relates to one of your Ramadan articles called Waiting for the Trumpeter of the King to Eat. You mention the words of your grandfather, Abbas, when you were asking for reasons for the fast as a young boy. What, in your view, is at the heart and the essence of Ramadan that was captured in your grandfather's response to your question?
And my grandfather Abbas was with philosophical learned years later was actually preaching a human-centered anthropocentric understanding of fasting. When, for example, I asked the moon sighting issue about the beginning of the Ramadan, and I was a young boy who started reading science and so on, I said, Grandpa, we know when the moon is going to come to the sky. Why are we just NASA calculations and just looking at the moon? And he told me, grandson, this is not about what is happening in the sky. This is about what's happening here among the human beings. It is that the moon is visible. It is that man saw the moon. It is not because what God is doing in the sky. It's because what we human beings are doing on the ground here that starts and finishes Ramadan. He had this, Sufi understanding of, as I said, anthropocentric understanding of all religious activities. In its core, we Muslims do every form of prayer and worship on a single reason. The single reason is the order of God. It's a divine revelation. Our God asked us to fast, we are fasting. But we have multiple purposes. And my grandfather Abbas was rather into the purposes side, not into the reason side. And one major purpose in his understanding, fasting was actually waiting for congregational eating. He said, this is not about stopping to eat. This is about waiting to eat together, because it all becomes into a festivity of eating after then. So it was not only about eating, waking up in the middle of the night all together as a family, as a community, going to the extra night prayer, walking to the mosque every night all together and so on. For Grandfather Abbas, it was a communal affair. It was not an individual affair altogether. And this actually made us Ramadanified. I later on, years later, I took this term out from Ustaz Fethullah Gülen's articles about Quranification of man, and I adapted it into Ramadanification of man. I believe that Ramadan, in its core, has a purpose of Ramadanifying us. What does it mean? It means, through fasting, we are trying to empathize other people who cannot find what to eat at other times of the year. Empathy. Through fasting, we are learning that we sometimes have to stop and let our bodies rest from extreme consumption. Through fasting, we do realize that in this world, we have a superior being observing us, and we have to wait, as Grandfather Abbas said, for the trumpeter of the king to start the meal, because we are not eating a meal at home. Actually, we are eating a global macro meal where we are all sitting at the dinner table of God, the King. So we have to wait to start eating for the trumpeter, that it is the time to eat. This, of course, can be moved into a more secular or transcendental understanding or trans-religious understanding of Ramadan. We cannot share fasting with non-religious, atheist, non-Muslim people. We cannot force people to fast with us. If they wish, they can, but we can actually share the Ramadanification aspect. If we can share the empathy that we gain with them, if we share the care that we gain through fasting, if we share the discipline that we gain through fasting with the world, the whole world can be Ramadanified. And I believe that is the essence of Ramadan, Ramadanifying human nature.
Kerim Balci, a wonderful point of which to end this conversation. It's been a privilege to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us from London this evening. Makiz, thank you to you also.
Thank you. Thank you, Makiz. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Well, Makiz, that's just all we have time for in today's program, but I can announce one special. On Monday, we'll be coming back together to talk about Eid.
Right,
And
wow.
thank you for being part of this team this evening, and thank you to all our viewers and for their endless support in watching these programs from home. And if you'd like to get this or any others, you can get them from the Affinity YouTube channel. This is the last of our Ramadan Conversations for 2020. I look forward to catching up again soon. Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak, and thank you. Stay safe, everyone.